Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. We're dissecting the scientific literature on how you can develop and evolve your side delts. But first, here are some fun facts about the delts you never knew. If we combine the front, side and rear delts, the deltoids are actually the biggest muscle, in terms of volume, of the upper body, being bigger than the pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi. Furthermore, although we typically consider the delts to consist of the front, side and rear heads, it's actually possible for us to divide it into 7 segments. In fact, a piece of text dating back from 1734 appears to be the first to document this. In more modern studies, the precise way researchers divide the deltoid can differ. Some use origin insertions or functional data. Nonetheless, these studies arrive at the notion of 7 delt segments. Here's how an analysis by Brown and colleagues depicted the 7 segments, based on each segment having distinct origins and/or insertions. Looking at muscular individuals with a low level of body fat, the segments can somewhat be seen. Though there's no unanimous agreement, I think we can generally consider D1 as the front head, D2 and D3 as the side head, and D4 to D7 as the rear head. We'll reference these segments more throughout the video and in future videos at the House of Hypertrophy. Nevertheless, the delts are a pivotal muscle for enhancing a physique. Many hypertrophy enthusiasts, and of course competitive bodybuilders, wish to acquire capped 3D delts. Across the interwebs, there's no shortage of information on how to develop the delts or any other muscle, but in this video, we aim to cut through the noise and provide crystal clear information derived from the current scientific literature on what you need to know to grow those side delts. How effective are compound exercises, such as overhead presses, bench presses, and rows for developing the side delts? We'll also be examining the utility and execution of shoulder abduction exercises, like lateral raises and upright rows. Let's dive in. There currently aren't any studies directly comparing different exercises for side delt hypertrophy. Fortunately, we still have solid literature from which we can infer how to effectively develop the side delts. Before analyzing this literature, we need to know about the principle of neuromechanical matching. To optimize growth of a muscle, we of course want to highly activate it with an exercise. However, how does your central nervous system, so that's your brain and spinal cord, decide what muscles to activate during an exercise? Think about it. The biceps, brachialis, and brachioradialis are 3 muscles that can flex the elbow joint. But in any elbow flexion exercise, how does the brain and spinal cord decide to distribute activation across the 3 muscles? It appears your brain and spinal cord preferentially activate the muscles with the best leverage during a movement. This is known as the principle of neuromechanical matching. The nervous system matches the recruitment of muscles to their mechanical advantage or leverage. What on earth is leverage? Leverage, in this case, refers to the muscle's moment arm. A muscle's moment arm is the perpendicular distance between its line of force and the center of the joint it moves. A longer moment arm means a muscle has a better mechanical advantage and potential to generate movement. Think of a heavy door. Imagine you're pushing this heavy door at different points. We can think of the moment arm as the distance between where you push the door and the door's hinges. If you push the door close to its hinges, it's difficult to open the door since the moment arm is small. If you push the door further away from its hinges, it becomes easier to generate the required torque to open the door because the moment arm is longer. Thus, longer moment arms enable greater torque, and so once again, the muscles with the best leverage, that is the longest moment arms, in any given exercise will likely be the ones most highly activated. Why have I just described all this? It's because we have solid research exploring the leverage the deltoids and numerous other muscles have for different movements. From this, we can derive conclusions about how the side delts may be most effectively trained. Many people perform a range of compound exercises in their training program, and vertical presses, including overhead presses, handstand push-ups, and machine overhead presses, are a category of compound exercises that heavily train the delts. But how effective are these for developing the side delts? All vertical presses involve elbow extension, so will train the triceps. But insofar as the shoulders, if you're performing vertical presses with a narrower to moderate hand spacing, you're predominantly performing shoulder flexion. If you're struggling to see how shoulder shoulder flexion occurs. Ignoring movement at the lower arm reveals this. It's also evident vertical presses involve shoulder flexion at higher angles. But how effective are these vertical presses, which predominantly involve shoulder flexion, for side delt hypertrophy? There are a few muscles that have leverage for the movement of shoulder flexion, and the side delts are one of them. Also, it appears both segments of the side delts have leverage for shoulder flexion. However, the front delts are the muscle that tends to have the greatest leverage, while the side delts leverage tends to be a whole lot less. Very generally, the front delts leverage is mainly 3 to 4 times greater. Thus, following the principle of neuromechanical matching, the side delts will be activated to some degree, but it likely won't be sufficient to substantially trigger side delt hypertrophy. Rather, the front delts will see the bulk of the stimulus. What if you perform a vertical press with a wider grip, or even with the dumbbells on either side of your head? You're now predominantly performing shoulder abduction. Eliminating the lower arm shows this. Also, this shoulder abduction is at higher angles. There are a few muscles with leverage for the movement of shoulder abduction, including the side delts, and both of its segments have leverage for it. At higher angles of abduction, both the front and side delts appear to be the ones with the greatest leverage, and they both have fairly comparable leverage. Thus, these types of vertical presses, where shoulder abduction predominantly transpires, will better activate the side delts, indicating it presumably will deliver great side delt gains in the long term, as well as front delt gains of course. But will it be enough for truly maxing side delt hypertrophy in the long term? I'm going to speculate probably not. I think to truly optimize side delt hypertrophy, we'd want an exercise where it solely has the greatest leverage for carrying out movement at a single joint. Before analyzing what exercises achieve this, let's quickly dissect how effective exercises like the bench press and rows are for side delt development. Horizontal presses are another category of compound exercises that include the bench press, push-ups, and machine chest pressing variations, and these can also involve some degree of shoulder flexion. Thus, the side delts will be stimulated to some degree with horizontal presses, but it will most likely be quite trivial since we know the front delts are the predominant shoulder flexor. On top of this, horizontal presses involve shoulder horizontal flexion. If you're struggling to see this, ignoring the lower arm reveals this. The pectoralis major is the muscle that largely has the greatest leverage for shoulder horizontal flexion. The side delts actually appear to have no leverage whatsoever for this motion. Rather, they have leverage for shoulder horizontal extension. Shoulder horizontal extension can occur with horizontal pulls, which include exercises like barbell rows, cable rows, and Australian pull-ups. More precisely, shoulder horizontal extension predominantly occurs when using a wider grip with these various rows. Thus, this will train the side delts, but it likely won't trigger notable side delt hypertrophy because numerous other muscles have greater leverage for shoulder horizontal extension, such as the rear delts, which seemingly have up to 3 times the leverage for shoulder horizontal extension versus the side delts. Narrower grips with horizontal pulls predominantly involve shoulder extension, and the side delts do not have leverage for this whatsoever. Rather, we know it's involved in the opposite movement that is shoulder flexion. Thus far, we've established various compound exercises can stimulate the side delts. Of note, vertical presses, particularly vertical presses performed with a wider grip or with the dumbbells either side of your head, are likely going to be great for side delt hypertrophy, but as alluded to, I'm skeptical it will be enough to truly maximize side delt hypertrophy long term. Presumably, we want an exercise where the side delts largely have the greatest leverage for carrying out movement at a joint. What exercise can achieve this? You probably guessed it, lateral raises. Tons of lateral raise variations exist. You can perform it in different planes. No, I'm not talking about aeroplanes, but rather the plane of movement. Lateral raises can be done in the frontal or scapular plane. You can vary the bend you have in the elbow and hips. You can perform it with a neutral, internally, or externally rotated upper arm. You can also perform it with different equipment, dumbbells, machines, and cables. How do various muscles contribute to shoulder abduction at different stages in the frontal and scapular planes? In both these planes, in the initial abduction stages, 0 to 30 degrees, the supraspinatus tends to have the largest leverage, followed closely by the side delts, and then the front delts. In the middle abduction stages, from 31 to 90 degrees, the supraspinatus's leverage rapidly drops off, and the side delts display the greatest leverage, with the front delts fairly close behind. In the final stages of abduction, Beyond 90 degrees, the supraspinatus has barely any leverage, while the side delt and particularly the front delt, especially in the scapular plane, see increasing leverage. At this stage, as alluded to when dissecting overhead presses that involve predominantly shoulder abduction earlier, the side and front delts appear to have fairly comparable leverages. Other muscles like the infraspinatus and teres minor have much smaller leverages throughout all stages. What does all this information mean for lateral raise execution? Strictly speaking, this data may suggest lateral raises in the range of 30 to 90 degrees of abduction may be the best way to isolate the side delts, since below 30 degrees the supraspinatus are highly involved, while above 90 degrees we appear to get relatively more involvement of the front delts. However, I think for most people performing the exercise roughly between 0 to 90 degrees is perfectly fine. The exercise is still very challenging beyond 30 degrees, which is where the side delts have predominantly the best leverage. When directly comparing lateral raises in the frontal to scapular plane, it's evident the leverages of the muscles are more or less similar. Some may be wondering about the traps. No, not those traps. I'm talking about the trapezius. The traps will naturally be activated during shoulder movement. There's currently no data I'm aware of that can inform us of how trap involvement may compare between different lateral raise variations. Nevertheless, feel free to experiment around with the different planes and even variations to find your preference. Interestingly, quite a lot of people actually report that lateral raises in the scapular plane feel better for them. Some lateral raise variations, such as dumbbell lateral raises, enable you to use internal or external rotation, as opposed to the standard neutral upper arm. Internally rotating your upper arm with lateral raises likely enhances recruitment of the rear delts, while externally rotating your upper arm likely enhances recruitment of the front delts. In fact, a 2020 EMG analysis by Corratella supports this. If you followed the House of Hypertrophy for a while, you'll actually know I'm critical of surface EMG studies, since it has numerous limitations and there are examples where it simply fails to predict muscle hypertrophy outcomes. Nevertheless, I think these EMG findings are pretty logical, and using surface EMG to compare subtle changes with the same exercise may be potentially more reliable compared to using EMG for comparing different exercises. Nevertheless, I'd recommend individuals stick to a fairly neutral arm position if the goal is triggering max side delt hypertrophy. Some individuals may like to slightly bend at the hip during lateral raises. Some may also like to have a slight bend in their elbow. I'm unaware of any solid research that provides insight into whether these provide any meaningful benefit or not. I will mention it's likely that excessively bending the elbow will only further enhance front delt recruitment, so avoiding excessive elbow bending is probably sensible if the aim is to target the side delts. Ultimately, feel free to experiment with bending at the hip or elbow to examine what you prefer. Lateral raises can be performed with dumbbells, machines, and cables, and there are even lying and leaning variations. At the end of the day, these fundamentally all involve shoulder abduction and thus are all going to be great for evoking side delt hypertrophy. It's currently not clear if any of the subtler differences between them could impact hypertrophy. One potential difference relates to resistance curves. Dumbbell lateral raises involve fairly minimal tension in the initial stages of abduction, while cable lateral raises involve more consistent tension throughout the abduction range of motion, so the side delts are loaded more at the stretched position. Remember, the supraspinatus is highly involved in abduction in the initial stages, but the side delts are still going to be involved well in these initial stages. The reason I bring all this up is that in recent years, the literature indicates that exercises that train muscles in a stretched position tend to build muscle faster. There currently aren't any studies demonstrating this with the delts, but some individuals have used research looking at the operating range of the side delt sarcomeres to speculate this muscle should indeed benefit from stretch. However, I believe there are a range of limitations with research looking at the operating range of a muscle sarcomeres to the point where I don't think it's that useful for informing us on whether a muscle will truly grow more with exercises attaining a stretch. Nonetheless, hopefully we get future research examining how the side delts respond to stretch. It's possible that cable lateral raises could very well be slightly better. This is not to say dumbbells are useless. Again, at the end of the day, these all involve shoulder abduction and thus are all going to be great for developing the side delts. In fact, with the dumbbells, you could experiment with partial range of motions in that initial position. You won't be able to attain as great of a stretch as you can with cables, and we know the supraspinatus is also going to be trained well in this range, but this somewhat lengthened side delt dumbbell loading might still be great for developing the side delts. For example, we've previously analyzed this study by Pedrosa at the House of Hypertrophy, which found that partial range of motion leg extensions in the initial position, which far from maximally stretches the quads, but still trains them at a more lengthened position, produced overall greater quad hypertrophy versus full range of motion leg extensions. So perhaps partial range of motion lateral raises in that initial position are also great. Another option is that you could perform your dumbbell lateral raises normally with repetitions to failure, and then immediately perform additional reps with a partial range of motion in that initial position. Feel free to experiment around. If you prefer to keep things simple, just select whatever lateral raise variation you prefer. Once again, all of them fundamentally involve shoulder abduction. Finally, within the same program, or across many months of different training cycles, you can of course vary the type of lateral raises you train with. Lateral raises are one of those exercises where you're never going to be lifting super heavy loads. Trying to go heavy can result in people using excessive momentum with poor technique. Don't be afraid to use lighter loads. We have a multitude of studies demonstrating that provided you're performing repetitions to or near to failure, reps between 6 to 35 can be similarly effective for building muscle. Moreover, you don't need to worry about trying to increase the load you lateral raise with every session, week, or even couple of months. Progressively overloading through increasing the number of reps you perform across workouts with the same load can be perfectly fine. We've previously analyzed a 2022 study out of the USA that found across 8 weeks, progressively overloading through increasing the number of reps you perform with the same load was as effective for building muscle to progressively overloading by increasing the load you use with a certain rep range. Another alternative is to use slower repetition tempos. The current evidence suggests individual rep tempos in the range of 0.5 to 8 seconds can be similarly effective for building muscle. So as opposed to training with higher rep ranges with fairly normal rep speeds, you could use the same light load but perform the reps with a much slower controlled tempo. Again, feel free to experiment around and find what you prefer. If you're looking for further ideas about constructing a hypertrophy program, the Alpha Progression app can help. It has a custom workout generator that deploys training variables based on meta-analyses and reviews from the scientific literature. Plus, it's very flexible. Specify your training experience, the equipment you have, and how often and long you want to train for. Edits to these custom workouts can still be made, allowing you to individualize things. The app also has a massive database of exercises, and it provides visuals displaying your long-term progress. The link in the comments and description gives you everything on the app completely free for 2 weeks. And if you like it and go beyond, the link gives you 20% off a subscription. We don't just partner with anyone at the House of Hypertrophy, so rest assured the app is quality. There's actually another compound exercise we've yet to mention that is likely highly effective for developing the side delts. This is upright rows, which involve shoulder abduction typically up to 90 or slightly more degrees. There currently aren't any studies directly comparing lateral raises to upright rows for direct side delt hypertrophy, so it's not currently clear how they may compare. It's possible upright rows, since it involves significant scapular elevation that will highly recruit the traps, is slightly less effective for the side delts, but this is very much speculative. If you only had to choose one for the side delts, to err on the side of caution, I think lateral raises are probably going to be a better pick. But in the real world, training muscles with multiple exercises can be perfectly viable, so the upright row is an exercise some people may consider. Some of you may be thinking, isn't the upright row a dangerous exercise? The guys over at E3 REHAB have done a tremendous job summarizing the actual scientific literature surrounding this topic. I'll leave links to their videos in the pinned comment, but let me speed through the main points. Upright rows are believed to cause shoulder impingement. Here's the top right of the body. We have the humerus and the acromion, which is part of the scapula. The space between the two structures is called the subacromial space, and within it are various tissues like the supraspinatus tendon. It's thought upright rows, through involving shoulder abduction with internal rotation, narrow the subacromial space and result in the supraspinatus tendon being compressed, causing damage by the acromion. However, multiple lines of research research would question this, and even question the whole notion of impingement as a theory. Firstly, we'd expect the upper area of the supraspinatus to be frayed and damaged via compression from the acromion, but a number of analyses find it's predominantly the underside that shows this. Secondly, there are very generally three acromion shapes that people may have: flat, curved, and hooked. We'd expect people with a hooked shape to experience more shoulder problems due to increased frequency of impingement, but the data does not support this. Related to this, in those with subacromial pain, smaller acromio-humeral distances do not appear to be associated with that pain. Thirdly, there have been speculations stemming from a 2011 paper that if you do perform the upright rows, perform it to no higher than 90 degrees of abduction. However, this appears to be misguided. Rather, it seems the smallest distance between the supraspinatus tendon and the coracoacromial arch occurs between 40 and 75 degrees in most people. At 90 degrees, it actually seems the supraspinatus tendon is no longer in a position to be compressed. Some of you may be wondering about the internal rotation with upright rows. Fascinatingly, the same paper indicates internal rotation actually seems to increase or have no effect on acromio-humeral distances, thus opposing the idea that internal rotation makes things worse. Given this information, if impingement was the enemy, we would want to avoid abducting our shoulder to 40 degrees in all instances, and plain lateral raises in whatever plane you're performing it would be dangerous. Fourthly, some have used the fact that upright rows mimic the Hawkins-Kennedy test, a test used to diagnose impingement, as evidence that upright rows are dangerous. However, this test actually has poor specificity and has been described to have little diagnostic value. Fifth and finally, shoulder decompression surgery, which involves shaving down the acromion and other structures to increase the subacromial space, should reduce pain and enhance shoulder function due to reducing impingement. However, a solid amount of literature suggests this surgery fails to provide clinically important benefits over placebo surgery in pain, function, or health-related quality of life. As described in a 2021 paper, the impingement theory has become antiquated, that is outdated, and we would also recommend to abandon the term shoulder impingement as it refers to this mechanical theory. So in summary, there simply isn't any strong evidence to support the idea that upright rows are dangerous, and we have compelling data challenging the impingement theory as a whole. When combining the front, side, and rear heads, the delts are the largest muscle in terms of volume of the upper body. Fascinatingly, we can actually divide the delts into 7 segments. There's no unanimous way to describe these segments, but we may consider the front delts to be the first segment, the side delts to be the next 2 segments, and the rear delts to be the remaining 4 segments. Many compound exercises will train the side delts, most notably vertical presses, particularly ones which involve wider hand spacing that necessitate shoulder abduction, will likely be quite effective for growing the side delts. Moreover, upright rows are another compound exercise that will most likely be very good for growing the side delts. Many fear the upright row is dangerous, but we analyzed a range of studies that would question this as well as the whole impingement theory. Generally, I do think if the aim is to maximize side delt hypertrophy, some kind of lateral raise is going to be helpful. There are tons of lateral raise variations. It's currently not clear if any particular one is truly superior. It's possible that cable lateral raises could be slightly better, as this more effectively loads the side delts in a stretched position, but at the end of the day, they are all likely going to be highly effective for triggering side delt hypertrophy, since they all fundamentally involve shoulder abduction in that approximate 0 to 90 degree range, which is where the side delts tend to have the greatest leverage. So feel free to train with your preferred lateral raise variation and execution. If you're interested in a breakdown of the science of how often you should train a muscle, feel free to check out this video. Or if you're interested in the science of rep ranges for hypertrophy, feel free to check out this video.